Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Eternal Reviews. Today we are going to review all the cards from Dead Reckoning. We've already talked about a bunch in the Eternal News when they were spoiled, but I'll still go over them again, especially since some of my evaluations might have adjusted a bit. So let's dive right in. Alright, so first we have Boar. So Boar is pretty interesting. It's not a fast spell, but it lets you kill any enemy attachment, and it creates and draws a copy of itself. So first of all, this can be utilized with things that have an impact, have synergy with you drawing cards. So that's like a minor effect there. The other thing is, since each copy is gonna copy itself again, you can kill as many attachments on your turn as you have power, basically. That also includes breaking aegises on things with attachments, which is pretty good. And at the end of the turn, you discard the copy of Boar. So basically you can only do it in one turn. This is basically very similar to the replicate mechanic that we know in Magic, and also to the replicate type mechanic that we already got with cards like Snow Pelting, but this is better than actual replicate would be for two reasons. First of all, the typical replicate thing, since in Eternal they would all resolve at the same time, would not go through Aegis, while Boar, you can just Boar something with Aegis twice, and then you kill the Aegis on the first time, and the attachment on the second, including face Aegis plus attachment, like for example Chalice or a relic weapon. The other thing is the minor upside that it draws you a copy. So if you have something that, for example, grows when you draw a card or has some other bonus for you drawing a card, this triggers it. So yeah, this is a really cool sideboard card. Not particularly main deckable usually, but an awesome sideboard card. Really like the card, and it's a pretty cool design. So it basically just kind of punches through everything, even like shields and aegises and stuff. So the cool card, and I expect we will see this type of mechanic on other cards in the future potentially. Next we have Oni Dragonsmith. That's a pretty cool one. First of all, it's another Oni, which is nice with the Oni Lord that we have. It has Dragon Ally, so once you play a dragon, it turns into a 3/2 quick draw, which is pretty strong. A 1/1 for 1 is not very impressive, but it makes all your dragons cost 1 less. The problem right now is we have a shortage of good dragons for this type of deck. Like what you could try is run this, say, in Skycrag, and just, or in, I don't know, Rakano, and play like 4 Crimson Firemaw. But Firemaw is the only realistically playable dragon that you would want in a deck with this card. And 4 dragons for the Dragonsmith, not a great amount, because if you don't trigger the Dragon Ally, the card is pretty bad, pretty weak, like not worth it. And also only having 4 dragons to accelerate into is a bit underwhelming. If we still had Soulfire Drake, a deck with 4 Crimson Firemaw and 4 Soulfire Drake would want Oni Dragonsmith turning Firemaw into a 3-drop and Soulfire Drake into a 4-drop, and giving you a reasonable chance that this Oni Dragonsmith is active at least by turn 4 as a 3/2 quick draw, while it before is going to be very low impact. Maybe the nerf to dragon costing 6 has something to do with this card happening together with how strong the dragon was doing at the time, and that with this card it might have pushed it over the edge a bit too much, not sure. But yeah, the other dragons are all pretty expensive and slow. Like we have Molod and Narkova at 8, we have Thunderstrike Dragon at 6, but it's a triple primal card, and I don't see like a mid-rangey dragon Skycrag deck wanting this card, for example. So yeah, the card is kind of cool and kind of good, except we lack the context for it right now, which makes it not really playable. But going forward in the future, we might see enough dragons to make this worth it. We have in Skycrag have Pearlescent Drake, so you could try and build something with like 4 Crimson Firemaw for Pearlescent Drake in this, but that still seems a bit iffy to me, especially because Pearlescent Drake also has Spark, so you need to be able to spark it on 1 turn earlier and so on. So yeah, but maybe someone can like Maybe someone finds a deck with like Fire Maw and Polish and Drake. I might mess around with it a bit, but I don't have high hopes. Next we have the Tripwire Granadan. We already talked about that in the spoilers. It's just a nice filler card for Granadans, I think. With Combustion Cell you can basically immediately deal 2 damage for 0 power. If you give up your Combustion Cell activation that turn, but that's fine. Like for example, your turn 3 could be Tripwire Granadan, shoot something for 2, and then play like an assembly line. That is nice. And Devour lets you use the Entomb on the opposing turn, on the opponent's turn and stuff like that, or generally at fast speed. So there's a couple of nice things you can do. And otherwise it's just like gonna be a decent thing that might ping down like an Oni Ronin, and then can trade with like a 2 health unit, for example. Next we have Memento Mori. We had a part of this spoiled very early. My problem is I think the card is 1 too expensive. I was expecting the card to cost 3. I think at 4 the card is really clunky. Not sure if it's gonna be any good. I don't know, maybe like a Curiox, like the Fire Time Primal Curiox deck might want this alongside Power Stone, so you can go like Power Stone into this, into Curiox, or generally have more chances of your Curiox being a 7/7 and being out earlier, as well as fixing all 3 of the colors of Curiox. And I mean, this obviously is something that also would go into like a into a 5-faction sort of control deck or whatever, but I don't really believe in this being a thing for now. But yeah, a bit underwhelmed by the card costing 4, really. Next we have Venom Rider. This card's pretty cool and actually also pretty good. It has Deadly and Charge, which is a bit weird. I don't get the Charge alongside the Deadly. It's really weird, especially for like a 4-cost 3/3. The Charge is just not that appealing, but it can come up nicely sometimes. Like for example, you need to kill, say, a relic weapon like a Rune Hammer or something, then the Charge will come in handy. But all in all, a 3/3 Deadly for 4 will usually want to stay home to block anyway. So the Charge is a bit out of place here, in my opinion. But yeah. But the good and powerful part here is the ultimate. You can pay 5, turn it into a 2/2, and then get a 1/1 deadly killer. They made sure that the brittle Sandstrider that you get costs 5, so you can't abuse it easily with Dark Return. But yeah, basically still getting to keep a deadly blocker that trades with a lot of units and proactively killing their best unit is pretty sweet. And this card also happens to synergize really nicely with Dark Return because of that, because then you get a 3/3 deadly charge back and you can ultimate it again, or you can, even if it has to be quick, just on 6 power go for like Dark Return on the Sandstrider, get the Sandstrider back, kill another thing, turn your Dark Return into a 6-cost Death Strike of sorts. So yeah, this card is interesting. It's pretty well balanced. It's not super powerful or anything, but it has a lot of like cool utility and things going on that make it interesting. Next we have Bury the Past. Already talked about the card. I still think the card is as bad as I said the first time. Triple time and 6 and not being fast just to like put a unit or a relic on the bottom of its owner's deck is just way too much, and yeah, way too underpowered. Then we have Vicaria, Valkyrie Captain, another spoiler we already talked about a bunch. I mean, a 1/1 flying endurance, while being a relevant unit type in Valkyrie, isn't that terrible, given that there's also Unseen Commando, for example, turning it into a 2/2, and the fact that it's mostly just like a ramp spell in the beginning that also buffs your other Valkyries is kind of nice, but the fact that it requires 6 justice to become a 3/2, I thought initially for some reason it requires 5, but yeah, requiring 6 justice to become a 3/2, to become a 4/3 is a lot, especially for any deck that has more than justice in it. But yeah, having this attached acceleration into, say, an Amelie or a Magto, for example, is kind of nice. The +1/+1 buff to Valkyries in your hand is a bit underwhelming, because there's not a lot of Valkyries right now that are playable, and the playable Valkyries already have really good stats, so buffing them by 1 is not that big of a deal. So yeah, we'll have to see if the card can make the card, because double justice on 2 is also very restrictive. The card might end up just being too restrictive in too many areas to make a big splash in the end. Next we have one of the hidden cards, Honor the Fallen, double justice 4 spell. Give one of your units the battle skills of each unit in your void. I think this card is pretty bad. It's just way too low impact, expensive and clunky, and not even a surprise since it's not a fast spell. So yeah, you're just playing a super clunky, situational, overcosted card that doesn't do enough for you when it does something. So yeah, the card is pretty terrible if you ask me. Next we have Inquisitors Blade. This was a really sweet surprise. One of the cards that weren't spoiled but are really appealing. Costing double justice makes it a bit more restrictive, but that's fine. It gives +3/+1 and flying, which is pretty good. Like, losing out on some health here for evasion is a pretty good trade-off for this type of weapon. And then it gets some form of revenge, but not actually revenge, since it only triggers when the wielder dies, not when the Inquisitor's Blade dies. That's why it's not worded with revenge. But what happens then is exactly revenge. Inquisitor's Blade gets Destiny and is put into the top 10 cards of your deck. So basically, it has revenge when the wielder of the weapon dies. But when the weapon itself dies, like for example somebody bounces the wielder of the weapon or just uses attachment removal on the blade dies and doesn't come back. But yeah, otherwise it's sort of like Magto, because also the effect never ends. So it comes back with Destiny, goes onto a unit, then if the unit dies, it goes back in the top 10 cards of your deck again, and rinse repeat, just like Magto, since after all it's Magto's weapon. So this might be what gives Magto his recurring revenge, basically. And now everyone can turn into everyone can have a piece of Magto's power. Next we have Ward Wielder. This card's kind of interesting, but also a bit awkward. First of all, it's an unseen, so that's nice. The problem is, without Protect, giving yourself Aegis is more expensive and less reliable, since having a 1-cost fast spell to turn this back into a 5/5 if the opponent breaks your Aegis would be really big. Like, for example, you block, the opponent pops your Aegis with a fast spell, and then before damage you just protect yourself again to turn to a 5/5 again. Eating the opponent's attacker is pretty powerful, for example. But yeah, there's still Protect that you can run, although it's worse and clunkier, and there is Island's Favor, which is okay to go along with this. And there's also Cobalt Waystone, but that usually only happens the earliest at turn 4, so it's a little slow. And then there's Mistveil Drake, which is probably too underpowered and too slow and clunky for a deck that would want this. But all in all, the card is kind of interesting, and I want to mess around with it a bunch. But it might just be a bit too much work to make, to get going, and too unreliable and conditional. Then we have Hailstorm. That's like the biggest spoiler that everybody knows about. This card is just a really big deal. Gonna buff up reactive controlling decks a lot against all the aggro decks, including the 3 health Gunslinger units and all the Rakano units. Especially against Rakano, this is a pretty big deal, because Lightning Storm is really bad against Rakano, while Lightning Storm against Gunslingers was still pretty good outside of 2 units basically, and Warcry buffs. So yeah, this is a big deal. Might also finally make Horu good enough just to be a control deck on its own. Who knows? Then we have the Raka Queensguard, another late spoiler before the adventure dropped. Problem is, triple primal is already quite a lot. 7/7 Overwhelm is not that impressive, especially given that it even dies to Annihilate, so it dies to all the cheap removal. It can even be permafrosted, so it can be taken care of for 1 to 3 power easily by most people. 7/7 Overwhelm is decent when it lives, and the summon effect is kind of nice. It's basically a living permafrost. It stuns an enemy unit and keeps it stunned while you have the Raka. I think that might even apply when you silence the Raka, but I'm not 100% sure. But I think the way it works, it should still remain stunned, because it's like a static ability that is not conditional on the text being on the Raka, it's just conditional on the Raka being around. But I'm not sure if that's how it's ultimately going to work out. I didn't get to test it yet. But yeah, so basically, if the opponent doesn't answer it, you also get to lock down an opposing creature. The problem is, the main problem of the Raka is being so easy to answer cheaply, making this part about as good as the 7/7 Overwhelm stats. Because, yeah, a lot of the time it's just not gonna live. The same goes for the other line. When you play Eileen, she gets Aegis. So this curves really nice into the 7-cost Eileen. Maybe there is some kind of big mid-range deck, like big Huru deck, that wants the 2, but the problem is just these cards and this type of play and strategy is so susceptible to tempo these days with all the cheaper removal that I'm highly skeptical that this is going to work out, and also that the Aegis on Eileen is going to be good enough, and then the stun of the Raka might interfere with the silence of Eileen, because if the opponent only has 2 units, one of them is stunned, you have to silence the stunned unit, because Eileen still works the way that you have to target 2 opposing units if they have to, which is really annoying. You cannot skip her ability entirely, you cannot skip it partially. If you play an Eileen and the opponent has units, you have to silence 1 if they only have 1. If they have 2 or more, you have to silence 2. And if they have exactly 2 and one of them is permafrosted or otherwise stunned, you have to break the stun, which is really annoying. And I think the card should have the summon of Eileen should be skippable, just like with any other summon of that kind. It makes the card much more awkward and worse. Anyway, skeptical of this card. It's kind of nice, but ultimately probably doesn't do enough when it's answered, because the thing is, if it's answered other than with a permafrost, it's like it never happened. So the opponent pays like 2 or 3 power to answer your 6 power, and there's no leftover effect, because it's not an actual permafrost, it's just a stun as long as the Raka is around. So if they kill the Raka had no impact on the game at all, basically. Okay, next we have Ripknife Assassin. Already talked about that in the spoiler. Another Unseen. Pretty decent. A bit worse early game, because deadly on a unit like this early on doesn't matter too much, because the units that trade with it mostly are the same size. And so the deadly doesn't do that much early on. But if you draw it later, the deadly means, unlike other 2-drops, like an outlaw or something, it's not blank. It just can like hang back and trade with the best opponent's attacker, or if they don't have small units, can attack into their big units, which they might not want to trade against your 2-drop and get some Warcry going. So pretty nice role player for shadow aggressive decks. Next we have the Argent Pursuers. So we finally know what the red tokens were about. This has Nightfall. You all know my opinion on Nightfall. It's basically a drawback, a downside, not something desirable. The other thing is, at the start of your turn at night, you get 2 1/1 reds. Problem is they can't block, so they're pretty low impact, because they're also not going to be good at attacking either. And it becomes even worse. At the end of your turn, if you have 3 or more reds, sacrifice Argent Pursuers. So you can't even like have a lot of the reds in play. I think this card is legit horrible and super underpowered. I don't get this card. I think this card is a joke. Also, it costs triple shadow. Like, why? Wow, I have no words for this. This card is horrible. Like, this card is worse than Pok Pok. And that says a lot. Like, Pok Pok at least has some things that make it interesting and kind of goodish or whatever, while Argent Pursuers is just a clunky relic with heavy influence requirements and a downside that generates very little upside in the process, and is even super restricted in the upside it can generate. Like, this card is just big joke. This is like now officially the worst card in the entire adventure to me. Next we have the second hidden card, In Cold Blood. It's a spell speed removal spell, kills any enemy unit. It's basically a non-fast death strike. But if it was a justice unit, the enemy player discards each copy from their hand and deck. So it basically extracts all the Magtos or Alchemists or Icarias or whatever else from the opposing deck. So this is a pretty solid card against the Magto and Icaria decks to strip them of their main like advantage engines or win conditions. They also can't leave the void, so they cannot dark return them or revenge them or recure them in any way. So even the like Magto in play that you kill cannot get revenged. But you can't really play it in Justice colored decks yourself because you lose all your Justice influence. So you probably want to like not put it into your Justice deck preferably. But you might still be able to in some numbers, like in the sideboard for example, and then you just hold back a Justice source or two, play Cold Blood and then play a Justice source after, if your deck doesn't need that much Justice for example. So it could still be like fringe playable in the sideboard of a Argent Port based deck for example. But yeah, the card is nice. It's another cool like solid answer for decks to fight cards like Magto, which we definitely needed since the change to Steward. And yeah, having like another universal unit removal isn't bad, even though a 4-cost non-fast isn't great. It's basically like a different take on Feeding Time. Next we have the Sunglass Dragonoid. Talked about that in the spoilers already a bunch, but what I forgot to talk about is this is actually pretty nice with Mysterium Orb and Infinite Hourglass. I'm not a big fan of Mysterium Orb. I think the card is too expensive and doesn't do enough, but Infinite Hourglass happens to be a cheap relic to turn on all the relic synergies. Like you guys all know my Sentinel aggro deck, and this card might be great for that deck because first of all the Hourglass prevents the Sunglass Dragonoid from exhausting itself in the first place because it can't be exhausted, so it comes into play ready. Then you can use it to bond out the 6-drop Sentinel with charge, and then on the opponent's turn it readies to block everything and be like a nightmare on defense. And that even applies to the Reckless, like you just attack with Reckless each turn, and then on the opposing turn it readies anyway. A unit with invulnerable to damage with Reckless and Endurance basically has no downside anymore, because the Reckless downside is negated by the Endurance. And having to attack is not a problem when you're invulnerable to damage anyway. So yeah, this card might be kind of interesting and good in this like Explorer, Sentinel, proactive tribal type deck that I built for my Eternal Bruce video. Next we have Jermiel, Amaran, Ghostblade. There's basically an alliance card for each alliance. Most of them are fairly cheap units. Sunglass Sentinel is the most expensive one. This is a pretty cool one. A 2/3 for 2 is pretty decent. 3 health is pretty big for the type of deck that will want this, because it blocks aggressive early units like Outlaw and all the 1-drops, which is pretty important, and Crownwatch Paladin and that sort of stuff. And the ultimate means that it is gonna matter later in the game. 2/3 is not the most aggressive stats, but it's still like a threat early on. And yeah, there are weapons like Hammer of Might, Vodakhan Staff, the new Inquisitors Blade, to name a few, that make you want to use this ultimate. So this is a really cool role player, and if you have seen me stream yesterday, I already built like a Combre aggro deck with this card that has been doing really well yesterday, so the card's pretty cool. I skipped this one by accident, so we go back to this. This is another really cool one, Sower of Descent. When you Warcry a unit or weapon, reduce its cost by that much, and Valkyrie ally Warcry 2. This card is really cool. First of all, 2/4 means it's buying you some time the turn it comes down, and also since it's more about the war cry really, and the text than the stats, the 4 health also means that it is fairly good at attacking to Warcry 2 without dying early on. And this cost reduction is huge. You can try and like build like a mid-range aggressive Warcry deck with cards like, I don't know, Amelie and Daisho and Icaria, and just use Sower of Descent to cheat them out early and big, and it can provide some really powerful draws. I will definitely work on trying to find the right deck for this card, because I think the card has a lot of potential and can do some really broken, powerful things. I really like the card. Next we have Equivocate, the removal-ish illusion card that Scarlet has been teasing. It's basically teleport that that afterwards transforms the unit into a random unit with the same cost. So basically a constructed playable teleport. Since teleport itself is too underpowered, but this just does enough to the unit to make it a constructed consideration if you want this type of tempo play. Also, it happens to actually go really well with Mindlink for anyone that's trying to like make Mindlink work, similar to like the event deck that Conley built. Because this basically buys you time with Mindlink, gets you back some tempo, and at the same time gets you a card, negating like the card disadvantage thing that this card usually has, by giving you the unit that it transformed into. So this is a pretty nice role player for Elysian color decks. Next we have Huru Pacifier. We all know that one already. It's one of the other big splashy spoilers that we saw. Card is just really good, like a 3/4 flyer with Overwhelm for 3 alone is already pretty good. Suppressing weapons is nice utility, and having 2 battle skills is nice utility for Unseen Commando, and being an Unseen itself also is great for Unseen. So this is great in any deck that can play it and doesn't heavily rely on weapons or want weapons, basically. Just a good undercosted 3-drop, basically. Next we have Anointer of the Faithful. We get a 1/3 lifesteal. On summon you give a paladin in your hand Bond. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of paladins and not a lot of good paladins. And this card at 1/3 is not particularly good at bonding either. But when you play one of your other paladins, they get a +1/+1 weapon on it. So if you play a second Anointer of the Faithful, it becomes a 2/4, for example. But also there are cards like the 3/4 lifesteal Minotaur Paladin that ramps you by a depleted Justice if you put a weapon on it. So now it's actually half decent, because if you have this guy out, it's actually a 4-cost 4/5 lifesteal that ramps you from 4 to 6. So that's neat. But yeah, it's still not going to be enough. And there's like other paladins like Groundwatch Paladin or Hero of the People, or the 3-drop that doubles its stats with Empower. But yeah, all the paladins are just like too weak, and this card itself is a bit too weak. Like, it's not that weak actually. If we had a bunch of good paladins, a 1/3 lifesteal with all these like boni would be pretty nice. But in context of the supporting cards, this card is too underpowered. It's sad. Maybe in the future it will become good, because I like the card. I think the card's pretty cool. Next we have Pok Pok Rockpacker. This card is pretty underwhelming. I think it's not quite as bad as I said in my initial review, because it's at least like a really cheap bond unit and generates a bunch of tempo and has synergy with cards like Shogun Scepter and some other buffs. But the problem is the card is still sort of bad, like too bad on its own, and deck building 101 tells us playing like bad underpowered cards to make your other cards better, or make them better with your good cards, is not good deck building, because you're going to end up with too bad of an end result way too often, while you're better off just playing good cards and make them better with other good cards, rather than playing weak cards to make them better with your good cards. So yeah, still probably not gonna do enough in the end. Also, it forces you to play sort of bad cards like the Fearless Yeti the 3-1 for 2, which is also not very good because you really don't want to play like 1 health 2 drops because they trade with way too much and die to way too much, like Highwaymans, Varus Favors, all that stuff. So yeah, it baits you into playing more bad cards to make this bad card better and stuff like that. So yeah, not happy about it. Even though I lost to a Pok yesterday with a Shogun Scepter on it. That was bonded out by a Fearless Yeti on turn 2. But my draw wasn't very good either, so happens. Next we have the Lesrai Sky Strider, another card that I want to like change my statement a bit maybe. The card is kind of cool and kind of interesting. Like the flying is nice with Lesrai Ranger and Beastcaller, and the also it's an elf ally, not a summon. I kind of forgot that it's ally and not summon, making it a bit worse. So since there's not a lot of elves, making it much harder to get this effect going, and 4 for a 2/2 is just too much. The card is probably gonna be too situational, not have enough support, and a bit too underpowered in the end to make it, which is really sad because I think the core idea of the card is really cool, but I think it should probably cost like 3, and maybe the thing here should be a summon, or if not, at least like it should cost 3 and maybe be a 2/3 or something, because there's just too few playable elves. Like the playable elves basically are Lesrai Ranger, Beastcaller, Champion of Cunning, and the Sky Strider itself. But yeah, drawing a spell from the top 4 cards and milling for your Dark Returns and Haunting Screams is pretty cool. But yeah, the problem is, first of all, you have to put Lesrai Ranger in your deck, which you might not necessarily want because the card is a bit hit or miss to make this better. And then if this doesn't live, your Lesrai Ranger is worth. If your Lesrai Ranger dies, this doesn't elf ally. Yada yada. There's a lot of problems. It's a bit sad because I really like the idea, the concept of the card, but there's too many ifs in the end, most likely, to make it work, which is really sad. So yeah. Next we have Overwinder. This is kind of an interesting and weird one. We get a 3-cost 2/4 Granadan. That might actually be interesting for the Granadan deck, simply because it's giving the deck more early game, which is something the deck really wants in my opinion. Just like having something to like stabilize you early on and buy you some time to set up like your 4 and like your 5+ drops. And Overwinder can do that while still being a Granadan. And when it hits the enemy player, each player discards the top 2 cards of their deck. So there's a bunch of things that can be done with this. It works with Dark Return and Gear Cruncher in the regular Granadan deck. You can try and use a Granadan early game engine in a Manacles deck, or with Manacles and Solitude, which is probably going to be too cute and too slow and so on. But you can also try and abuse it with like Grasping at Shadows and try to go for sort of like a Void-based reanimation type Stone Scar deck. Not sure, there's a bunch of interesting things that can be tried with this. Not sure if any of them is going to be good enough or work out, but there's a couple of cool and interesting things that can be done and tried with this. Especially given that the mill 2 is for both players, so it's symmetrical. You can try to use it to mill your opponent, you can try it to get stuff in your own void. And last but not least, we have the Mitotic Wisp that we already talked about. A 0/3 flyer is a decent blocker early on. Reducing Radiance is not that big of a deal because they are not a good and plentiful tribe. There's not a lot of good Radiance. There's also not a lot of Radiance. So that's not going to have that much of an impact. And the same is with the ultimate. It's really conditional, and we also don't quite know how exactly it works. And then all you get to do is tutor for a Radiant of your choice from your deck. And there's not really a good Radiant to tutor for, because the best Radiant would probably be the Tormentor, which is not a card you can put in your deck. You can only put Whispers in the Void or Mask in your deck to get the Tormentor, so it's not gonna get you the Tormentor. And the other things are pretty meh. So yeah, this card doesn't have the support right now and might overall just be a little too weak. But maybe in the future it gets enough good Radiance to make a splash. We'll have to see about that. Maybe we see some of these like lesser tribes in this adventure in the next set. Like maybe we see more Radiance more elves, maybe soldiers, stuff like that in the next set to make these tribal cards more playable than they are right now. All right, that's it again for this Eternal review with all the cards from Dead Reckoning. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments how you like the adventure, what you think of my evaluation of the cards, how you like the cards, what you think of certain cards. And yeah, I really enjoyed the adventure, the campaign. It was pretty nice. I was a bit disappointed that only the first couple of games were with like pre-constructed decks and the rest was just with constructed decks. I think it's always kind of lame to having to play constructed decks. I really would love the campaign to be all like pre-constructed decks to make it a bit more challenging and interesting, because you don't know what's in your deck. You're playing something that you not normally play. You're also playing something that's not as powerful as your typical ladder deck. Yeah, I think it would make it like a more immersive and cooler thing, sort of. But yeah, we got that at least for the first couple games, and it was nice to see some more of the story. Campaign was pretty well done, just like the last one in that regard. So yeah, go check it out. Get the campaign, get all the cool new cards, start brewing. Come join me on my stream later today to watch me brew and test more with the new cards. And yeah, if you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like and subscribe, turn on notifications, check out my social media and stream over here. Follow me on Twitter, like my Facebook, follow me on Twitch to not miss my streams. This was Eternal Reviews, Dead Reckoning. I'm ManuS. Thanks for watching, and I'm out. Bye.